Good morning. This is the third lecture in Poli-Sci 3050 on Chapter 2, and we talked about policy preferences in the last one. Here we look at actual lawmaking. And a few important things to talk about here. On page 39, there are a couple of models of lawmaking. The first, called the unitary model, the unitary democracy, is basically what many people would find to be the ideal version of Congress. That is, everybody gets involved, there's a great deal of debate and deliberation, and ultimately some perhaps compromise is made, and you come to a final agreement. If you think about a model or an ideal version of lawmaking, our founding fathers used the phrase deliberative majority. Notice how we have two houses of Congress. As you know, part of that was about the debate over representation, the House having population-based representation, the Senate having equal representation. But there's more to it than that. Basically, what we're talking about here is how Congress should work. So we have developed, as we'll talk about in a little while, we've developed committees that divide the work of Congress, and each committee has a variety of subcommittees. In the last lecture, I told you to look up caucuses within Congress, and these are not policy making, but they influence policy over time by people coming together with shared interests. And so, again, there's a division of labor. We have the two political parties, which over the last couple of decades have become rather strong parties. They follow their leadership very closely. You may be familiar with names like Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi. The reason you're familiar with them is because leadership has become important because the parties have wanted leadership to be important. If the party members did not want leadership to take the lead, to be that important, it wouldn't be so. Leaders only have the power that their conferences give them, their party organizations give them. So in terms of lawmaking, we have that unitary model, which again seems like it can really work, but there's a lot of deliberation. It's not necessarily all majority driven, and so maybe there's some compromise and that. You may be more familiar with what we call the adversarial model of democracy, and that seems to be a good bit of what happens these days when there's a good bit of polarization. Now, what's restricting adversarial democracy to some degree is that we don't have large majorities in Congress anymore. Technically, right now, the Democrats have a majority in the Senate, although it's 50-50. What makes it a majority? They have the vice president, right? The vice president votes when there is a tie in the Senate, and so technically is part of whatever party he or she belongs to. In the House, very sorry. In the House, we have a small majority in the hands of the Democrats right now. It's gone back and forth. Keep in mind, from 1954 until 1994, 40 years between elections. For 40 years, the Democrats had a majority of the House of Representatives. The Republicans never had a majority from 1954 until 1994 in the House of Representatives. So you may think, wow, the Democrats were extraordinarily powerful, and to a large degree they were. We see a lot of their policies, such as the civil rights movements and such as that in the 60s, although liberal Republicans were very instrumental in helping to pass those. The problem was, of course, we did have a split Democrat Party. We had Northern Democrats who were what we would consider liberal, and we had Southern Democrats. You know, we had the solid South. Almost all of the South was Democrat, but they were populist and they were conservative. And so basically what happened in the late 1960s is we had a realignment. Many of those Southern, especially white conservatives who were Democrat for generations, started to become either independent or more so Republican. And so in 1994, the Republican Party won a majority of seats in the House for the first time since 1954. And that's significant because that shows how things shifted. They did so under the leadership of Newt Gingrich of Georgia, a Southerner, who, again, now was a Republican. So that's another important consideration, is that not everything is always as it appears. So the Democrats had a majority. They were able to get a good bit passed, but they were also divided. Some liberal Democrats had to rely on liberal Republicans. There used to be a such thing as conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans up until basically the late 60s into the 1970s and so. So again, we have two different models. The adversarial model is basically one side saying, look, we don't need a whole lot of debate and deliberation because we feel strongly about issue X and we're going to pass it, if indeed they have the votes to do so. And so that's, and of course, life is always somewhere in between. You can have two models of behavior, but in reality, it's a combination of the two, and that's the case here as well. If you continue with Chapter 2, you come to a pretty basic part. If any of you took Political Science 2010, you may remember a good bit of this. What does the Constitution say about representation and lawmaking? Well, the first thing is, under the Articles of Confederation, we had a unicameral Congress and nothing else at the national level. No presidency and no courts. So now we have three branches of government, including within that a bicameral Congress. As we talked about, part of it is representation based, but it's also to divide power. Just like we might say Congress acts as a check on the president, well, the House and the Senate might act as checks on one another. And so we have separate institutions that share power, is another way of putting it. In terms of what Congress does, what Congress cannot do, we look to two landmark, very important parts of the Constitution. First, Article 1, Section 8. I strongly suggest you look up the Constitution, look at Article 1, Section 8. One thing you will notice is that it's quite detailed. Nothing much in Article 2 on the presidency is nearly this detailed. It lists that he's commander-in-chief and chief executive and he makes appointments, but it's a very short article compared to Article 1, and it's a little vague. Article 1 on Congress is far more detailed. The Founding Fathers felt that Congress would be the most important, and for that matter, the most dangerous institution. It is within Congress that they feared you would get a tyranny of the majority. Our founders were not so much concerned with tyranny of one person, tyranny of a minority of people. They were worried about tyranny of the majority, that a majority faction would get hold of power and basically not let go, not compromise, and become tyrannical. So they decided if that's going to happen, it would happen in Congress. And so bicameralism is part of the way to prevent a majority from exercising too much power. We have had periods of time in our history where we've had the House of Representatives dominated by one party while the Senate is dominated by another party. And so that's part of it. Well, looking at Article 1, Section 8, you have, first of all, what's called the enumerated powers. The power to tax, the power to declare war, power to raise an army and navy, etc., and so forth. These are expressed enumerated powers, very specific things that are granted to Congress. Some of those powers are given only to Congress. And in other words, the states do not have the power to declare war. Only the United States Congress does. And so some things are only at the national level. Other things are concurrent powers. Both Congress at the national level and state legislatures have the power to tax, for example. Two separate systems, both working concurrently. So at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we have what's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. Again, I strongly suggest you look it up and read this particular clause. Congress can make law that is necessary and proper to carry out their duty. Well, this opens things up. That's why it's often called the elastic clause. It makes things very flexible for Congress. And so how do we know if Congress has gone too far in exercising an implied power? Well, either if the president signs a law, the law could be challenged in court, and the Supreme Court ultimately would have the voice to say that this law is unconstitutional because it extends beyond government's power, whatever that might be. So Article 1, Section 8 is mostly about what Congress can do. Article 1, Section 9 is a list of things Congress cannot do. What's called a bill of attainder, a law written basically to benefit or punish a particular person. Ex post facto laws. If you do something today that's legal, tomorrow it becomes illegal. They can't punish you for what you did the day before. If you're still doing it, they can, but if you're not, they can't punish you if you did something while it was legal. So that's an example of that. So list of things that Congress can do, list of things Congress cannot do. In Article 1, Section 9, it says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. In other words, Congress has what we call the power of the purse, the budget power. This can be controversial in some ways. If a president takes money from one part of government and transfers it to another part of government without congressional approval, that could be problematic. We saw that in the early 70s under President Nixon, and we saw it again just recently when President Trump moved money from the Pentagon, from the Department of Defense, to that were lined up for certain purposes, and he decided to pay for part of the border wall with it. And so, again, controversies can arise in these situations. In terms of the House and the Senate, and you already know, I'm sure, that it takes both houses of Congress to pass a law, and the law must be the same law. In other words, they can't pass a House version and a Senate version, send those two to the president and say, you decide. The ultimate bill that's passed must come out of the House and the Senate exactly the same. And that's why we have what's called a conference committee. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are some differences. In the House of Representatives, all tax bills, all spending bills must originate in the House of Representatives. This is because, let's keep in mind, early in our history, the House of Representatives, first of all, considered the people's house, representing relatively small districts compared to entire states like the Senate. Well, the other factor is that the House of Representatives was the only directly elected body. Today, as you know, we directly elect our senators, but that was only since the 17th Amendment in 1913. So from 1789 until the 17th Amendment in the early 20th century, just about 100 years ago, we only directly elected the House of Representatives. The Senate was chosen by state legislatures. So the money situation was given to the House of Representatives. Money bills must begin in the House. This is because they were directly tied to the people and directly representative of the people. The senators were really not supposed to represent people. They were supposed to represent their states and the interests of their states. And that's still true. However, what has been the impact of the 17th Amendment? There are still people today who do not like the 17th Amendment because they feel that it ties the senators to this concept of re-election. They have to please public opinion to continue to get reelected. And that is not necessarily what the founders had in mind for the United States Senate. So that's something to keep in mind. Speaking of the Senate, in terms of differences with the House, there are some things that the Senate does that the House is not involved in. So, for example, if the president signs what is called a treaty, treaties are specifically mentioned in the Constitution as the law of the land, they have to be approved by 2/3 of the United States Senate or more. Now, there are other agreements that can be made. Executive agreements are very popular over the last several decades. They outnumber treaties by a very long way. They don't require anything by Congress. And this can be controversial. The president can sign executive agreements that have the force of a treaty. They have force of law. And this shows just how strong the presidency has become in recent decades and really over the last century. But the Senate, when there is a treaty, is in charge. I mentioned NAFTA earlier as an example of an executive legislative agreement. That's a particular type of executive agreement. That's kind of on the other side of the coin, where both houses of Congress have to approve of the agreement for it to have the rule of law, for it to be enforced. So we have treaties, which 2/3 of the Senate have to approve. We have executive agreements, which only the president has to approve. And then we have executive-legislative agreements in which the legislature, both houses of Congress, have to approve of that. Again, those aren't specifically mentioned in the Constitution. There is a mention of other agreements, but that's just how it has evolved over time. As the book describes, there are certain protections for Congress people. They cannot be arrested while in session. They cannot be prosecuted. And this, again, is to prevent an overzealous, say, Justice Department from arresting United States congresspersons, thereby preventing them from doing their job. So there's some interesting protections there. The speech and debate rule, you may want to look that up, for example. And so the next part, I'm going to end this video now, this recording, and we're going to move on to a little bit about committees and about the leadership of Congress.